the question, so both people who write about monocropping and people who write about experimentalism are give pretty overdetermined stories, I have to say, which is there's not a lot of uncertainty, and they describe a series of inevitable events going from the abstract to the concrete. So often the stories about monocropping and blueprintism read a little bit like a conspiracy theory. And often the stories about democratic experimentalism read a lot about good guys or good people having clever ideas and sort of fixing their stuff. So what I try to do in this paper is think about when does it go either way. And I'm attentive to, I'm very inspired by sociology of science and sociology of science and technology studies in particular. And they're very attentive to translation. The idea that as an idea moves, it changes meaning, but translations mean specifically enrolling different kinds of actors and coalitions of people to sort of move the ball along. The phrase that they use is that an idea sometimes is like a rugby ball, and you don't know where it's going to end up. The person who put the ball on the field can't tell where it's going to go, but if you look at who's passing it along, you get a sense, right? So I won't spend too much time. So I want to talk about a couple of cases, but before that, let me quickly talk about the global translation and the conduits, the kind of international conduits that took the story from Brazil to the world. In the first moment, it travels via Workers' Party networks. Something like 150 cities copied the original model and adapt it between 1990 and 2000. It's very much seen at that time as a way for the left to govern well, and it's very much seen as a way for the left to accomplish its goals while remaining in power. There's this kind of instrumental story about it. But what happens in the late 90s for some reason is that people begin to tout the good governance aspects. That is, participatory budgeting was something about helping the left do its job, that is, redistribute and stay in power, to something like participatory budgeting can fix 15 different things. And I'll just read you a quote from a how-to manual from 1996. Participatory budgeting, an efficient instrument for making important political, economic, and social achievements. It will give you greater transparency in the elaboration and execution of a budget, more social control of the budget and public finances, the creation of a new standard of distribution of resources that would permit the meeting the needs of the poor people, increasing municipal resources, fighting clientelism, fighting corruption, increasing the legitimacy of municipal administration, the sharing of power between authorities and society, the strengthening of cooperation and solidarity, the affirmation of the culture of dialogue and rights, mobilization of the citizenship, the broadening of the public sphere. That's a lot of stuff that this one instrument is supposed to do. What happens also is that the city of Porto Alegre begins to aggressively market this in the world stage. They win a couple of best practice awards. They begin to send delegations to different places promoting this idea. And in the 2000s, this sort of the diffusers or the assemblies become global. So then it's the UNDP. The EU funds an exchange and emulation program. There are 5 or 6 international networks dedicated to participatory budgeting that are formed. I should mention the World Social Forum begins to play a very important role here in advertising this. The city of Porto Alegre hosted the WSF the first 3 years. Although I should also note, parenthetically, the consultants who would do this stuff later with the various agencies are also the same people at the World Social Forum. So it's not as if these are distinct individuals, even if these are different networks. This idea travels. It connects with an emphasis on good governance, an emphasis on doing decentralization well. It seems like international development agencies were looking for something like this. And it does become more and more a best practice, a blueprint. There is since we're among friends, there is actually a kind of funny radio show that you can listen to, which is how to do participatory budgeting. It's the part of the Africa Good Governance program It started in 2007. It's actually on the bank website. And basically, this radio show takes you through the 10 steps of how to do participatory budgeting and the best lessons kind of thing. Now, I said, so this international assemblies don't determine how things are going to look like. So let me talk to you about 3 ways that it lands, and this is the kind of analytic heart of the paper. The first case I discuss, and I should say this is part of a larger book I'm writing with a colleague from Spain. We're doing an ethnography of implementation of participatory budgeting in 2 sites. The first case I discuss in the paper is in Cordoba, in Spain. After the transition to democracy, Cordoba was known as a very progressive city with a very strong left-of-center culture. The sort of alter-globalization movements were traditionally very strong there in the 1990s. And people from the Porto Alegre administration begin a direct exchange with the city of Cordoba. The IU, the Esquerda Unida, and the Workers' Party of Brazil had a kind of ideological affinities. So people from Porto Alegre travel there. They tell them how to do it. Cordoba has actually quite a bit of resources to put behind the participatory budget, as well as to money to spread around. The legal structure in Spain was quite decentralized at this time. That is, the local government had a lot of discretion about what to do. So in many ways, it seemed like the perfect place to do participatory budgeting. And they do it for the first 4 years on a very social justice, direct democracy model. They start to advertise it. This is an attractive new way of government for the left. This is the renewal of the left in Europe. And what happens is civil society revolts against it. So civil society, the organized neighborhood movement, is very upset at this idea of direct democracy because they feel slighted. Throughout Spain and in Cordoba in particular, there's a strong tradition of neighborhood associations. And the neighborhood associations wanted several things. For example, instead of direct democracy, they wanted a certain number of seats assigned to the presidents of neighborhood associations. They wanted to be able to facilitate the meetings throughout the city. So in 2005, there was this sort of funny movement of civil society against deliberative democracy. So they're able to change the process away from a deliberative with a more associative democracy model. That is, the associations gain a lot of power, and even then they felt it wasn't enough, and they bring the process to a halt. So that's that's an example of where the networks of people don't quite match up when you aren't able to negotiate the interests. So participatory budgeting continued to be done in Spain. However, from then on, everyone who did it reserved special seats for the neighborhood associations. So no one repeated the Cordoba mistake. Let me talk for 2 minutes then about one other case, which is the case of Peru, which is a case that comes close to monocropping, which is an example of a kind of imposition of a blueprint. And this happens after Fujimori gets out. There are a lot of moments in Peru at the time there's openings for citizen discussions. There's a Acuerdo Nacional in 2002, a sort of national accord, concertation style, if that word means anything to you, about 30 policies the government wants the society should come to, 30 policy goals, including strengthening democracy, and one of them is participatory budgeting. There is an interesting struggle. There's a couple of cities in Peru that are doing participatory budgeting. One of their mayors gets elected to National Congress, and somehow a law mandating participatory budgeting emerges in Peru in 2002, 2003. But in the process of the crafting of the law, there were lots of compromises that different political parties asked for. So, for example, the conservative parties asked for different kinds of checks. For example, government officials have to make up a majority of the councils of the participatory budget, and regular people couldn't participate. They wanted someone to be called a participating agent, to be sponsored by an association that had been in existence for at least 3 years. anyways, this goes back and forth. But what happens in Peru is that by 2007, there are 661 participatory budgets throughout the country. This is much more than in Brazil. This is faster than in Brazil. This is the fastest place that we know of, but it really is a kind of monotonic repetition of one blueprint in completely different contexts, yet the process looks the same. And as far as the evidence we have, it's pretty far from a deliberative process in the sense of deliberative decision-making by regular citizens affected by these decisions is pretty absent. Okay, so let me just say three conclusions. Okay, this is obvious to you maybe, but it wasn't obvious to me. What travels by deliberation is very different. As we look around the world, I mean, things can be called deliberation, deliberative democracy, participatory budgeting, but actually it can mean very different things. It can be very, very different, and we shouldn't ignore that. Second, the array of actors who are involved in making an idea stick in a particular place makes a lot of difference, maybe even more so than the kind of international assemblies that bring it there. And the fundamental question of who will speak for the people, who gets to be the authorized civil society person, who's the people, actually turns out to be the trickiest issue to negotiate, and the one I think that both determines whether it becomes blueprinting or not, or even whether it works in the first place. Thank you.